because this is the literal chemical structure they're based off of. If you look at the historical development of SARMs, they're based off of these primitive anti-androgens that people are using for hair loss prevention, like bicalutamide. These are like primitive anti-androgens that were chemically modified to create tissue selective SARMs. What's up, guys? Derek, moreplates.com. Today we're going to be talking about topical SARMs and their potential therapeutic applications for hair loss prevention. So this is something I've touched on a handful of times in the past, but I've never made a dedicated video to it. And I've already talked about the effects of oral SARMs in terms of a hair loss prevention capacity, but I haven't really touched on the topical, which is more recent idea that came to mind earlier in the year, and I've seen it play out a few times anecdotally now through personal acquaintances and friends and whatnot. And basically, let me just elaborate the mechanism here before we delve into some of the more scientific stuff. So basically, when you look at hair loss in its start to finish cascade of events, basically the thing that mediates this follicular miniaturization, this mystery, is essentially androgens. So the higher the androgen load in your body, the more hair loss you're going to get, more or less. So if you're hair loss prone, you raise your androgen index or your androgen load via exogenous androgens, you're going to have more hair loss. Like, this is why if you take anabolic steroids, it accelerates your hair loss. This is why if you don't take anabolic steroids, your natural steroids are going to cause hair loss, but just to a less severe extent than if you injected a bunch of trenbolone or a bunch of masteron or a bunch of whatever. So the thing is with, let's just look at, standard treatments like finasteride, dutasteride. So these work, they're not anti-androgens, but they work by reducing the amount of androgens in your body. So how does it do this? It inhibits the enzyme 5-alpha reductase, which prevents testosterone from converting into the far more androgenic metabolite DHT. You probably already know how this works if you're watching this video at all. So this is how 5-alpha reductase inhibitors lower the androgen load in the body and reduce hair loss, is they reduce the amount of DHT being converted. So that's, one way to reduce androgen load. It doesn't eliminate it though. And you still have a residual amount of DHT binding to androgen receptors, because finasteride, even if you use a 5 milligram dose, you're still only inhibiting 70% of your systemic DHT. If you use dutasteride, you're inhibiting, 90 to 99%. So DHT is more or less, not a factor anymore when you're on dutasteride, but you still have, first of all, you have like a 100% spike in scalp testosterone when you inhibit 5-alpha reductase, because now you have a bunch of testosterone that can't convert to DHT. So you have the spike in T, and you have the rest of your T that would already be there even if it converted, even if you had that whatever amount converting to DHT. Like, you have all this testosterone unaccounted for in your body, which has its inherent androgenic activity. Like, even if you knock out all DHT in your body, you're still gonna have facial hair, you're still gonna have body hair. Why is this? It's because you still have androgenic activity in your body, and this is, mediated through the testosterone. I've done a video on this before where I literally nuked my DHT to 0 with dutasteride, but I still had my testosterone like literally on the high end of the reference range, and I still had hair loss progression. I still had facial hair growth. I still had all the androgenic telltales of somebody who has androgens in their system. I still had a libido. I still had a functioning dick. I still had all these things mediated by androgens. So that's how 5-alpha reductase inhibitors like finasteride and dutasteride work. So they don't interact with the androgen receptor though, which at the end of the day, if you want to prevent all androgens from wreaking havoc, you have to deal with the androgen receptor, which is where the development of topical anti-androgens or anti-androgens in general started to, come to be. So, when looking at transgender, like male to female transitioning, the first thing they'll do is introduce estrogen because it, crushes test levels and it's the feminine hormone essentially. But in addition to that, they introduce anti-androgens, which are designed to crush testosterone and DHT levels. Now, there are some anti-androgens that interact with the AR and they basically work by competing with testosterone and DHT for androgen receptor activation. So even if you have like bicalutamide, for example, the way it's going to work is by preventing testosterone and DHT from binding to the receptor. So even though like on paper, you're still going to have a normal testosterone level, in fact, it will go up because there's going to be less binding to and, you know, transcribing their effects at AR. You're going to have normal endogenous sex hormones on something like bicalutamide, which is used by people for hair loss prevention systemically. It's like a very powerful anti-androgen, as well as topically. Well, it's not actually that powerful. It's just the half-life and the accumulative serum concentrations eventually make it very, you know, formidable against endogenous androgens. But on paper, these people using it, they have normal sex hormone levels. Like they don't have a crush test level to 0, which is whereby other anti-androgens like cyprotetorone acetate, I believe that's what the drug name is. It's either cyprotorone or cyprotetorone acetate. Something like this mediates its effects by just crushing androgens. While they accomplish the job they are intended to do, they're very poor ways of dealing with androgens in the body. This is like the ideal scenario would not be let's destroy our hormone levels and make us castrates. You know what I mean? Like we don't want to have to walk around like a eunuch just to prevent hair loss. But you have to combat androgens somehow. So these are like the primitive methods of combating them. You either inhibit DHT conversion, which is going to prolong or prevent hair loss for a significant amount of time for some people. For some people, really, really sensitive. Having this testosterone not being accounted for, you're still going to have your progression of hair loss just the same. It's just going to be slower. For, you know, people, transgenders converting from male to female, obviously the anti-androgens work well, but at what cost? Like obviously if you're trying to transition to female, you're trying to become feminine, so it's a bit of a different story. But for people who are trying to maintain masculinity, muscle mass, masculine features in general, if you're using an anti-androgen designed for people transitioning, you know, it's not an ideal scenario. The ideal scenario would be something that just deals with the stuff at the androgen receptors on the scalp and leaves the rest of your body alone. This is where topical anti-androgens had such therapeutic promise. And this is where things like RU58841, CB0301 come into the picture, whereby their mechanism is instead of you ingesting it and crushing all your androgens in the body, you apply it topically. Their molecular size allows them to get in, but the half-life is so short that it doesn't really cause a systemic crushing effect like these other oral anti-androgens do. And the binding affinity is, you know, high, at least with RU, to an extent where you can combat a significant amount of endogenous T at the androgen, endogenous testosterone. That's what I mean by T at the androgen receptor, and at least compete with a formidable level of binding affinity to DHT. It's not as high as DHT, but it's still substantial enough that you can actually, you know, like lower your androgen load quite a bit in the scalp region. And then even once it gets systemic, the half-life is so short that you really are, you know, most people are side effect free when they take it. The people that aren't, you know, obviously that's a whole nother video, which I've covered in the past as well, and we'll probably make more dedicated videos on in the future. But anyways, that's how topical anti-androgens work. It's not like they're significantly different than oral. It's just that the attempt here is to try and keep anti-androgen activity localized to the scalp. And then if it does get systemic, it's to such a low degree because we're using something topically here that only small amounts get through into the bloodstream on paper. You know what I mean? And even if they do get in there, the half-life is so short that it's kind of irrelevant. So that's obviously not exactly how it plays out in real life. And if you get one of these topical anti-androgens systemic, you still get the same negative side effects, just to a lesser extent. Much like, you know, topical minoxidil versus oral minoxidil, there's a reason why oral minoxidil works way better, but it's way more side effects because you're literally using something topically, a little bit gets systemic, creates some side effects like, you know, the increased heart rate, lowered blood pressure. But when you use it orally, it's just all the effects are magnified because you're taking way more and you're getting way more into the system systemically. And there's also more hair growth, but at the detriment of way more, you know, side effects. It's like more or less the same thing with anti-androgens. If you take something orally, it's going to work better, you know, in most cases than if you take it topically. So, but it's also going to be less side effects topically than orally. But at the end of the day, it's just like a milligram for milligram difference in terms of systemic activity. So this is also where the potential therapeutic application of dutasteride and finasteride come in a topical setting, because it's like, okay, well, let's just inhibit 5-alpha reductase at the scalp so then we can avoid the anti-androgen activity in the body. And we see that that is effective as well. Again, though, the same outcome is it's going to get systemic to some extent, and it's going to inhibit DHT in the body to some extent. Is this going to be as much as the oral? No, but it's probably going to be less effective than the oral as well. So at the end of the day, though, how does this all intertwine with SARMs? So what I theorize, and I've seen, first of all, I've seen I've seen some people who are very hair loss prone integrate oral SARMs with exogenous estrogen into their hormone replacement therapy protocols. And it's not really hormone replacement therapy. It's just that it becomes hormone replacement therapy because if you use an oral SARM for long enough, you're going to suppress hormone production to an extent whereby you're essentially, you would need HRT essentially. And that's why you would need exogenous estrogen with it, because eventually you're going to crush your estrogen into the ground if you use a high enough dose of an oral SARM for a long enough time. But the idea is that the anabolic activity it sustains, the reason they were designed is to be tissue selective for anabolic activity, and they work, fairly well at that, or at least some of them do. And the ones that do work well, they exert significant anabolic effects in muscle tissue and bone with a relative lack of androgenic side effects. So by not only competing with endogenous testosterone DHT with a SARM, you're competing for androgen receptors, thereby doing the same thing as anti-androgens, but in a more efficacious way, because you're actually transcribing useful effects in tissues as opposed to anti-androgen effects. Like we're transcribing the anabolic effects we want without the androgenic effects we want, at least at certain dosages with certain SARMs. So we basically get like the best of both worlds when it comes to certain SARMs at certain dosages. You also suppress endogenous androgen production with SARMs. To what extent depends again on the SARM, the dose, the binding affinity, such and such, etc. This is where exogenous estradiol comes into play to replace these levels therapeutically, because if you have not enough testosterone aromatizing into estrogen, you are going to have not just hindered hair outcomes because you need some estrogen, you're going to have a terrible libido, you're going to have bone mineral degradation, you're going to lose vasodilation in your cardiovascular system, you're going to start to have cardiotoxicity issues, you're going to have neurodegeneration because you don't have that estrogen to provide that neuroprotection. There's a lot of factors that need to be accounted for when it comes to just crushing your androgen levels, because you could have a concurrent, crushing of your estrogen levels, which is going to facilitate all these negative effects. So oral SARMs work. It's just, there's a lot of interplaying factors that go into nailing down a reasonable protocol. And you also have some degree of organ stress when it comes to anything going through the first pass when you take it orally. The theory that I concluded with the topical SARMs is if you actually look at the metrics of how you can define if something could be an efficacious topical, basically the mole was defined in such a way that the molar mass of a compound in grams per mole is numerically equal for all practical purposes to the average mass of one molecule in atomic mass units, which is Daltons. So, for example, the average mass of a molecule of water is about 18.0153 Daltons. So the molecular mass of water is about 18.0153 grams per mole. So it's equal, like 1 to 1. So when you look at the molecular weight of SARMs in particular, let's look at S4 andorine as an example for this. The molecular weight is 441.4 grams per mole, which is also 441.4 Daltons. So compounds need to be less than 500 Daltons to get through the skin. So we already know that the 500 Dalton rule for the skin penetration of chemical compounds and drugs is, pretty, like science-backed information that a lot of people use as a reference point when creating topical solutions. So like I've mentioned already, topical finasteride, dutasteride, and topical anti-androgens. First of all, topical 5-AR inhibitors, they only work by inhibiting 5-alpha reductase. They don't account for testosterone at all. So androgen receptors are not being, occupied by anything, and thus testosterone can transcribe its miniaturization via gene expression in the scalp just the same, even if 5-alpha reductase is inhibited. With topical anti-androgens, they bind with, a formidable binding affinity to testosterone, depending on the efficacy of the compound in question. Like, for example, CB0301, much lower binding affinity than something like RU. Therefore, the dosage and the potency, things are going to be a lot different. and other topical anti-androgens as well. Just, explaining the process of how this works, though. They occupy androgen receptors in the scalp, essentially, and compete with testosterone and DHT. And those are, fairly effective. But the problem is, like I mentioned, is once they go systemic, they will to some extent. And how much this is going to affect you is going to depend on your endogenous hormone profile, as well as numerous other factors like skin porosity, if your derma rolling way too close to application, things like this. But, the problem is, if an anti-androgen gets systemic, this is like the last thing you want as a male, is having anti-androgen activity that hinders muscle mass, hinders, masculinity essentially. So where's the therapeutic efficacy of topical SARMs? Basically, they occupy the same androgen receptors as topical anti-androgens as well as endogenous androgens. So if I'm taking a topical SARM that has a molecular weight that is low enough to penetrate the scalp, I can, in theory, get a SARM to the androgen receptor to occupy it with as high of a binding affinity, actually higher in some cases, than testosterone itself, thus competing with endogenous androgens to a very significant extent, much like, anti-androgens already do. And at a practical level, there are actually numerous SARMs that have better binding affinities than traditional anti-androgens used for hair loss prevention. When you have a topical SARM or, a systemic SARM through oral administration or injection, they're going to go to androgen receptors and occupy them. This is how they work. But the thing is like I mentioned already, they're going to compete just the same. Anything that's, its target is androgen receptors and to occupy them. If it's competing with endogenous T and DHT, it's working in the exact same way as an anti-androgen. But when it transcribes its effects in tissues, fortunately, it's tissue selective anabolic activity with a relative lack of androgenicity. So an anti-androgen, when it binds, all it does, it's like a mute signal almost. Like it's like no androgenic activity at all, but it also has no anabolic activity. So it's kind of like a crap thing. You know what I mean? Like I don't want my androgen receptors occupied by some crap hormone that doesn't provide any benefits. Like while it does have like a mute signal essentially, because it's like not androgenic at all, it's not anabolic, so it doesn't help me. It's just making me less masculine to prevent hair loss. But SARMs, on the other hand, their relative lack of androgenicity is formidable in many cases to literal anti-androgens, because this is the literal chemical structure they're based off of. If you look at the historical development of SARMs, they're based off of these primitive anti-androgens that people are using for hair loss prevention, like bicalutamide. These are like primitive anti-androgens that were chemically modified to create tissue selective SARMs, which then occupy androgen receptors with a higher binding affinity, lower androgenic activity in the body by competing with endogenous androgens, lower endogenous androgen production to some extent as well through HPTA suppression. On paper, it's not really significant enough to crush androgen levels too significantly if using topically especially and at a therapeutic dose orally, and then injection wise as well, it's more efficacious than oral. But anyways, getting beta off track, basically they work by competing and occupying these androgen receptors, preventing testosterone and DHT from binding, lowering androgen production to a relative extent depending on your dose, but at the dose used for hair loss prevention purposes, it would have a very minimal effect on endogenous androgen production, at least in theory, and in practical application anecdotally. And on top of that, while we're competing with these endogenous androgens with just as effectively as anti-androgens, if we do have a situation in which a SARM goes systemic, what happens at that point when it transcribes effects in the entire body? It just induces anabolic activity. So basically, if you have a topical anti-androgen like bicalutamide or, like RU or CB or whatever, if these things get systemic, you start to have anti-androgen side effects. You start to have, lethargy. You start to have, libido downregulation. You start to have erectile dysfunction. You start to lose muscle mass. You start to, wither away, essentially. Fortunately, with anti-androgens like RU, the half-life is so short, this is typically irrelevant. But anyways, without getting way too off track, a SARM, if it even gets systemic to begin with, it would only probably be beneficial, to be honest, because it's just going to induce a minor amount of anabolic activity with a very, very relative lack of androgenic activity and the most minor amount of androgen suppression that it would make almost no difference on blood work, at least in theory, and in practical application, anecdotally in some cases. This is where the premise hole comes from. If you have something that is lower than 500 Daltons, it can be applied and get through there. the target of these compounds is still the same androgen receptors that anti-androgens are trying to bind to. So you can therefore occupy these same androgen receptors with a more efficacious compound like a SARM, which is developed off of the backbone of these chemicals to begin with that people are using for hair loss prevention, but nuking their masculinity at the same time. And then even if you do have some residual amount of that compound get into your blood and go systemic, all that happens is you accidentally get some muscle growth, basically, or some bone, bone tissue, bone or muscle tissue anabolic activity, essentially, with a relative lack of androgenicity, perhaps a bit higher than that of an anti-androgen, because SARMs are not going to be completely neutral like some anti-androgens, but the actual amount that it's going to stimulate is minimal. The viralization effects that occur with SARMs is just not really seen at therapeutic dosages in women. You've had girls using upwards of 100 milligrams of ostrine in clinical trials and having no adverse effects noted. You have people using a few milligrams of LGD. You have people, tolerating up to 22 milligrams in clinical studies. And there are lots of, there's not lots, but there's data to reference on women using this and having no viralization. So if you have a lack of androgenic activity, we can theorize that it's probably going to be something that's going to prevent hair loss from continuing because you're crushing the androgen load in the body. And concurrently, the worst case scenario, if it gets systemic, is you're not going to have muscle loss. Instead, you're going to have a bit of muscle stimulation probably. So this is where I see the progression of topical agents kind of going, and this is where I think a lot of therapeutic promise lies that has been overlooked by people using really primitive compounds to accomplish things that can be accomplished with more progressive and efficacious means than is currently being there's people that don't want to become feminine that are crushing their masculinity in order to prevent hair loss, which I don't blame you. Like, hair loss is like one of the worst things that can happen to your insecurity and your self-image and blah blah. There's a lot of people who watch my channel who are like hardcore bodybuilders who think you should just go bald and gain as much muscle as possible, and that's fine. But a lot of people, a lot of their image comes from their hair, and a lot of people look terrible bald, and I can totally be on board with that because I feel the same way. Why else would I be making content about this? So at the end of the day, you have people using the most primitive compounds like Spiro to crush their androgen levels when you could be using something that potentially lowers androgenicity in the body to a formidable extent, but without fucking up your electrolytes, without dropping your masculinity to zero, without, reducing your muscle mass to the point where you can't even enjoy like gains in the gym anymore. Like, there's better ways to mediate this, in my opinion, than what most people are doing that have like hardcore aggressive hair loss. So I think that SARMs have a lot of therapeutic promise in this area. Injectable and topical SARMs in particular are worth exploring, and oral as well. Like, I know people who've had success with therapeutic levels of oral SARMs with exogenous estradiol, and they did well and kept their hair and gain a bunch of muscle at the same time. Is that a long-term strategy? Maybe not, but I think that something like topical is very promising in that it is the molecular weight of most of the efficacious SARMs is low enough to actually get there to where you're trying to get it to the AR, occupy them, transcribe effects. If it even gets systemic and transcribes those effects in other organs, it's at most the detriment to you would be maybe your lipids would be thrown off a bit. You might have a slight hit to your endogenous androgen production, but at the cost of if an anti-androgen went systemic, you would have a total destroying effect of your endogenous androgen levels or their ability to transcribe effects in tissues, loss of masculinity, loss of muscle tissue, loss of X, loss of whatever, a million things that are negative associated with any other of these agents going systemic, whereby SARMs, if they go systemic, worst case scenario, you get the, effects of what an oral SARM would do, whereby you gain a little bit of muscle at the expense of potentially lowering your estrogen levels a bit, whereby you might need to supplement with it. At the end of the day, I'm kind of just rambling. The point is I don't think most people are going to have a massive hit to their hormone profile in any capacity that is worth even using adjunct treatments with. I think it is a very promising option for occupying AR, and if it goes systemic, the effects it transcribes in tissues are a lot more beneficial relative to something like an anti-androgen, whereby you destroy muscle tissue and masculinity, and SARMs, won't. So that's basically what I'm trying to get at, and I'm just having a hard time because I just recorded like 7 videos and I'm kind of my brain's a bit dead, but hopefully I got the point across in this video sufficiently. I might do a follow-up video. I do know some individuals who've had success with topical S4 in particular. There are other efficacious SARMs with molecular weights under that 500 Dalton level where they could, work as well. And S4 in particular, the major detriment is the effect it has on the eyes. If you've seen the eyesight side effect, obviously when it's topically applied, the occurrence of this is much lower. But again, it's, we're talking about chemicals here that are not approved for human use. So expecting fully safe treatments when we're talking about this stuff is kind of impossible to guarantee anything. I'm just telling you what I've seen in my experience, and you can, relate it to your own research and look into stuff yourself. But, I think other SARMs with much higher binding affinities and low enough molecular weights can mediate this anti-androgen effect in the scalp even better than S4. And if they go systemic, again, like I mentioned, you get a bit of anabolic activity with, a relative lack of androgenicity anyways, relative to an anti-androgen, which would just, wreak havoc in your body as a male. So anyways, take from that what you will. Thank you guys for watching. Please like, subscribe, check out my blog, moreplates.moredates.com. Check me out on Instagram at moreplates_moredates, Facebook, Snapchat, Twitter, podcast link in the description below. If you guys can drop a 5-star rating there, helps the algorithm there, I believe. And that's much appreciated when you guys do that. Hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell if you want to get notified when I post. I also highly recommend you subscribe to the mailing list below, because anytime I put out a video like this, which is super all over the place and me just rambling and kind of, trying my best to accumulate my thoughts into a coherent and presentable format, I end up just, going on a ramble about, scientific things that may be outside of the realm of most people's understanding. And I try to make things a lot more digestible and consumable in the articles, whereby I separate everything into concise subsections. I include any clinical trials and clinical studies I reference within each subsection, so you can actually go delve into it further yourself to understand it and, research whatever I'm talking about and see where my findings even came from to begin with. These articles all get emailed to you right away after I publish them if you're on that mailing list. So there's definitely a lot of incentive to do that, because everything I mentioned in this video is not going to be linked here. There's no studies I've linked, there's no trials, there's no nothing. The article is concise, broken down, professionally formatted, proofread, very easy to digest relative to this, and has all the citations that you would need to reference what I'm talking about. So thank you guys for watching. Talk to you soon.